learnt our lesson that you cannot start from above, you must start from below. So we want that we should have this kind of an awareness program right across the country, and based on the enthusiasm that comes out of the participation, then one can think of building an organization. I am a bit disappointed that our friends from other sectors have not done a good mobilization for this meeting. I wish there were more people from Sanchar Nigam and from power sector and other sectors. Finally, I want to say very clearly that one thing which was very clear in Guru Murthy's speech yesterday and which will be clear in today's everybody's talk is very clear. What is happening is the privatization of profits and nationalization of losses. We will not allow it. We will fight, we will fight, we will fight and not allow it to happen. Thank you very much.
Comrades, we are really honored that Dr. Venkatesh Atreya is here. He studied chemical engineering in Indian Institute of Technology, but later on chose to become an economist, and he was one time officiating Vice Chancellor of the Bharathidasan University. He is one of the well-renowned economists of this country, and his contribution to the public sector in the fight against the so-called LPG, liberalization, globalization and privatization, has been very crucial in putting a block to the so-called reforms. He has written exclusively on these issues. And when this LPG was introduced, he was heading an organization called All India People's Science Network, and we conducted a campaign called Hamara Desh, in which we had talked about the need for safeguarding the public sector, the education, the health sector, and we had published 10 booklets, which became a very good campaign material. He is also one of the people who was an architect for launching the National Literacy Mission, because of which the literacy rate in this country has improved. And he was also associated with the National Literacy Commission in Tamil Nadu as a member of the State Literacy Commission, and he has written a book on literacy and empowerment, which is co-authored by Mrs. Sheila Rani Shungat, an IAS officer renowned IAS officer in Tamil Nadu. We have, in the State Bank Officers Association, we have had him when we organized a similar seminar when the Moody's had downgraded the rating of State Bank of India, and we published it as a booklet. So we are very happy that Comrade Atreya is here. He will speak on the overview of the global economy and the Indian economy, and he will focus also on the public sector. Dr. Atreya, please.
Can you hear me in the back? Is it clear in the back rows? No echoes? Very good acoustics, I must say. First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me to be here to share my views on the current situation of the Indian economy. And let me also thank the organizers and my good friend Thomas Franco in particular for a very generous introduction. I'm especially delighted to be on this platform along with other distinguished members on the days, because my good friend of at least 30 years standing, if not more, Ashok Rao is here. And Ashok, Ashok is like a force of nature. If you're with Ashok, you know that there's a lot of energy flowing and he's not likely to take any injustice lying down. So it's a pleasure to be on the same platform with Ashok and to revive some of the jointly militant activities we've been engaged in for a very long time. Sometimes in very pleasant words, but militant nonetheless. And I think it's a pleasure, therefore, to be here with Ashok. I heard his stirring call in just 2 minutes. The call was fight. And I will take off from where he left. We've now had about 2.5 decades, more or less, of these so-called new economic policies. They should not be called new. They're no longer new. LPG is the other term that Franco used, and each of these terms demands some explanation, and I will spend a couple of minutes in each. Liberalization is a very nice word. You know, it's nice to be liberal, not sectarian, not narrow-minded. Students like teachers to mark the scripts liberally and so on. But liberalization in the Indian context, post-91, has meant quite something else. Although touted as a way of preventing the small man from being subjected to bureaucratic hassles and therefore deregulating being very important to free the small entrepreneur and so on and bring out enterprise, etc. In practice, what liberalization has meant is the removal of all norms of accountability on the part of large private players, domestic and foreign. This has been the essential meaning of liberalization, that you leave the field free for the large Indian and foreign players in the private sector to do as they wish. Even when they evade taxes, you try to change legislation so that this can be justified. Or if you pass legislation holding into account, you ensure that it is not implemented. Essentially, we've had a free run for large private capital, Indian and foreign, in the last 20 odd years in the name of liberalization, freeing them from all norms of accountability. The notion that corporations are accountable to the shareholders is a very interesting myth, given the relative non-participation of the vast majority of shareholders in company affairs. So we really have now an economy which is increasingly controlled and run at the behest of a very small coterie of large Indian and foreign private players. And this is a fact of life that must be not camouflaged under the notions of India being a family-based economy and family savings being important. All that is bogus. I mean, basically, a large majority of Indian households do not save. They're below the poverty line, they can't even survive. So what is often referred to as, this family character Indian economy is actually a camouflage for an economy increasingly dominated by a fairly small number of large Indian and foreign players. And that's a fact of life that one must not run away from. And liberalization has been primarily about freeing them from all government controls, freeing them from all norms of accountability, number one. Second is privatization, which is often read very narrowly in terms of disinvestment of government stock and public sector enterprises. Now that part is very important, and I think it's good that we are fighting such disinvestment. I remember a set of PowerPoint presentations from Ashok Rao, which I have used in my classes from the early 90s, which documents the absurdity, logical absurdity of privatizing profit-making public sector enterprises by asking a very simple question. If X is buying share in a public sector enterprise, he or she does so because it's going to make profits. Now, if he or she has the confidence that it will make profits, why is the government not having the confidence? Where is the argument for privatization of public sector enterprises? There is really no argument logically at all. A surplus is that to be made. If it is made in the public sector, it is available for development funding. If it is not, it is in the pockets of some private player. And what he very prettily summed up as privatization of profits and nationalization of losses is the name of the game in this sense of disinvestment. But there is a larger sense as well. Privatization is not just disinvestment of government stocks in government-owned enterprises, but also the handing over of responsibility for vast domains of activity which used to be considered a state responsibility at some level: education, health, infrastructure. Now, what happens when the state abandons its commitment to these spheres and opens them up for profit maximization, profit-driven activity in education, health and infrastructure? What happens is not a mere change of management from public management to private management, but a fundamental change in the logic of the activity. That is, an activity which was driven by some notion of social good earlier under government ownership or under government jurisdiction, now becomes an activity driven by private profit maximization. Now, it follows then that if that is the case, education, health and infrastructure will become increasingly unaffordable for the vast majority of the people in this country. The poor in this country cannot afford an education which is driven by private profitability because it entails high fees, and we all know as parents from LKG to college the kind of travails parents go through to get their children admitted into a school where parents end up taking examinations on behalf of the children, where they pay through the nose. And of course, it's very likely that once the children have graduated and taken the degrees and gone off to the US for employment, the parents will be left alone in old age. That's a separate issue. I'm not getting into the problems of old age persons in our country. It's a huge issue that's coming up. But what I'm saying is that health, education and infrastructure, if they are now driven by considerations of private profitability, there will necessarily be problems of access for the majority of our population. A small proportion of our population will enjoy improved access, of course, and that will be presented as development. So this dimension that privatization is not only about disinvestment, but also about abandoning government's responsibility for a wide variety of activities and turning them over to a profit-making, profit-driven mode of activity. That's important. The third element is globalization, and this has two elements to it. One, of course, is the question of imports and exports of goods and services. Now, in 1991, the combined value of imports and exports of goods and services as a share of GDP was about 14%, 1/7 of the national economy. Today, the share of the sum of imports and exports of goods and services is roughly about half the GDP. And if you include the transitory inflows and outflows of capital as finance, the exposure is much greater. So essentially what this aspect of globalization has done is to make India far more open to the world economy and far more vulnerable to external developments anywhere in the world. And it hasn't brought a great deal of benefits for the vast mass of people. It may have benefited some sections of the population in some ways. But an even more important, and in my mind, the most significant element of globalization is the opening up of India to relatively unregulated inflows and outflows of capital as finance. This is the most fundamental thing. Because the moment you allow an economy to be exposed to unregulated inflows and outflows of capital as finance, the area available to the sovereign authority, the government, to make policy shrinks a great deal. Whenever the government takes a policy measure forward, it has to immediately think of what will the investors think, what will the foreign investor think. If I were to spend more on health and education, because people demand it, and run a slightly larger deficit, will that attract the wrath of Standard & Poor and Moody and Fitch? And will they downgrade our rating? And then will foreign capital exit? So the fear of flight of foreign capital undermines greatly economic and political sovereignty. It prevents governments from responding to the needs of the people who have elected them. So a Chidambaram might make all kinds of promises in election, but on holding office he will say, I have a fiscal deficit to control, so I can't do these things. In fact, it's interesting that Chidambaram, as a matter of fact, signed into law, so to speak, or made operational the FRBM Act in 2004, 3 days before he made his budget presentation. Then he has the reason to argue that, look, I can't spend on education and health because I'll run into the problem with the fiscal deficit. Now, this whole obsession with the fiscal deficit, an obsession I must say, unfortunately, bankers also share. It's not entirely unwarranted, but it is overdone, a great deal overdone. This obsession with the fiscal deficit has meant that governments are unable to respond to the needs of the populations by undertaking appropriate expenditure. Of course, in principle, you could argue that a deficit is, after all, the difference between two terms, receipts and expenditures. So why not increase receipts? Why only cut down expenditures? You could argue that, but the problem is, in India, fiscal deficit reduction has been mainly led by expenditure reduction, And the argument for that has been that if you try to mobilize more resources from the rich, you will be hurting their incentives. There's an incentive problem. So it's very interesting that when it comes to the rich, you invoke an incentive problem. When it comes to the poor, you invoke a lack of resources problem. Very differential treatment of the two segments of the population. This is the fundamental political economy of liberalization, of privatization, of globalization, that basically the entire economy is tuned to cater to the needs of a very small elite, and the needs of the bulk of the population and the nation as a whole are put on the back burner. So that you can denationalize your assets, hand over your financial sector to foreign players, privatize the banking sector, all the rest of that follows from a mindset that believes that the investor so-called has to be wooed, enticed and incentivized, but the poor can go take a walk. This is the logic of this whole entire process. And I think what we have now at the end of 20 odd years is interesting proof of what this entails. Chidambaram informed us in his last budget speech before they quit office that India has been on an annual compound rate of growth of GDP of about 6.1% since 1980. Very impressive. 3 decades plus of 6.1% growth of GDP is quite remarkable historically speaking. But the question to ask is, what kind of growth has this been? Who has it benefited? Who has it not benefited? And what has been its nature across different sectors? Now, if you look at today's economy from that vantage point, one of the things that strikes you is that the material producing sectors, agriculture and industry, have done rather less well in the period of liberalization, and it is the service sector which has grown the fastest throughout this period. Agriculture in particular has been through several phases. The phase of 91 to 97, when the impact of neoliberal policies was yet to be felt seriously. Phase of 97 to 2004, completely disastrous phase, when we imported global deflation. This is the time that we, in the WTO, we accepted removal of quantity restrictions on imports. We were decimated by globally declining commodity prices, and we had the phenomenon of farmer suicides beginning in the late 90s. Then some partial recovery after 2004, but on the whole, if you take the entire period, the growth of agriculture in the economy in the neoliberal period has been very modest and much less than it was in the 1980s when it grew at about 4% per year. Not only has the growth been less, there have been serious issues with food grain output. I work in the area of food security, and I can tell you that if you take the period from the late 90s to about 2004, the growth of food grain output was 0.7% per year, which is well below the rate of growth of population. So in fact, per capita food grain output was declining in this country, exposing a large part of our population to serious food insecurity. There's been some recovery, as I said, but the recovery is still very fragile, and it's not clear how sustainable the recovery is. This year is going to be a bad year, so ups and downs are there. Industry has grown very, very modestly, and manufacturing in particular has done quite poorly. And this has a lot to do with the failure to strengthen the public sector, failure to invest in frontier areas, making public sector institutions sit on the reserves, not invest productively, and denying them the kinds of access that private sector has to all sorts of booties from the government. This whole process of starving the public sector and degrading it in the last 15-20 years has had very serious consequences. One of the most serious consequences, for example, is in fertilizer sector, where we have not had a public sector plant in fertilizer, and fertilizer prices are skyrocketing in the world. You import that into your economy, you have high rates of inflation, you create an economy which is based on private motorized transportation and not public mass transportation, and you then complain about the rise in diesel and petrol prices and complain about the import bill. A whole litany of abuses that one can document in policy, which have really meant that the manufacturing sector and the industrial sector have done relatively poorly. In fact, the share of manufacturing in India's GDP, after all these years of proclaimed high growth, remains at hardly 15-16%, contrasted with about 37% in China, for example. Now, the sector that has grown, of course, is the services sector. And there again, it's a dual character. There is a part of the services sector that most of us tend to identify with, financial sector, banking, insurance, information technology, communication services, tourism, hotels, and so on. But this occupies a relatively small proportion of the labor force. the larger bulk of the labor force in the service sector is really in what you call make-work occupations. Because you have an economy and society in which there is no social protection for the poor, therefore the poor have to work at something in order to survive. If you don't get employment in industry, in agriculture, then you end up opening maybe, you're sitting on the road and offering to shine shoes, or you travel in trains and offer to sing so that you can get some money, or you sell flowers in a bus stand, or you sell papers in a traffic light. A whole range of service sector occupations, so-called, are really of the make-work, low productivity type, reflecting a huge amount of disguised unemployment in our country. And the growth that has occurred has been singularly ineffective in addressing the question of employment. So the growth we've had over the last 25-30 years has been very sectorally biased towards service sector, and within that, the bulk of the population has derived very little benefit from the kind of growth that has occurred. In fact, even in the manufacturing sector, for example, there has been a significant rise in productivity and therefore in output, but the share of wages in value added has gone down so dramatically that the entire increase in productivity and the surpluses resulting therefrom have accrued to capital, to the big capitalists, not to the working people. This is the nature of the growth in this country. And this growth has not addressed the issue of employment in a significant way. Unemployment remains significant in this country. The rate of growth of employment in the reform period, if you take the National Sample Survey data from 83 to 93, 94, 2011, 12, the rate of growth of employment in the reform period has been significantly less than the rate of growth of employment in the period before the reforms. Poverty is a very interesting subject, and we have probably had more committees on poverty than on any other subject. Every time the government's poverty estimates become obviously incredible and nobody believes them, government will appoint a committee to have one more attempt at measuring poverty. First of all, the poverty line we have is what I call a destitution line. I call it the line of non-death. It's a level at which you can neither die nor live. It's not a line at which you have decent clothing, that you can send your children to school, you have a roof over your head, nothing of that kind. It is a level at which, defined originally in calorific terms, it's a level at which you don't die. Now, the current debate about poverty built around official poverty lines is a complete waste of time, because we know, if you've done any major economic survey in the country, as I've been doing with the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, we've done some surveys in about 25 villages across the country in several states. We find massive levels of deprivation in all these 20 odd villages in 7 different states. We have, for example, I'll give you some indicators of deprivation. If you take women aged 16 years and above, in practically all these villages, half or more of the women have not had 1 year of formal education, not even 1 year of formal education. If you take these 20 odd villages, most households live in single room houses. Most of them, of course, don't have access to toilets. Most of them have very inadequate access to very unsafe drinking water. You can think of a number of indicators. In not a single village in these 7 states did we find 100% enrollment in schools in the age group 6 to 14. We found that about 10% of children in the age group are working across these 25 villages, which were chosen quite without regard to their being particularly poor. So I can tell you that whatever micro evidence we have from the ground, and whatever macro evidence we have from sample surveys like the NSS, and of course the National Family Health Survey, tell us that the outcomes of this growth that has occurred in terms of the well-being of the population are far short of what